Good afternoon and welcome to the Surrey Art Gallery, everyone. I'm Ingrid Colt. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs for the Gallery. And we're truly privileged to be able to welcome our speakers today, Thom and Robert Davidson. I'd like to make just a few announcements before we begin. First, I'd like to acknowledge in our audience Leanne Davison, Manager of Visual Art for the City of Surrey and Director of the Surrey Art Gallery. Leanne. And I just want to tell you a bit about our program this afternoon. We'll run until about 3 o'clock with 15 minutes after that for your questions of Robert and Ian. And following the conversation, we're going to have a small reception down in the lobby, just downstairs where you came in. The reception will last until 4 o'clock. I'd like to take a moment, too, to acknowledge those who've helped with today's event. Allison Raja for her assistance with organizing the event, Marie Chapman, our events hostess, and the Art Center tech staff and front of house staff, as well as our volunteers, Philippa Joy and Shelley Liu. If you are in need of anything this afternoon during your time with us, please feel free to ask any of the staff for assistance. And lastly, I ask that you turn off your cell phones, just like going to the movies. Turn off your cell phones and please refrain from taking photographs as we are videoing this event. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Jordan Strum, the Curator of Exhibitions and Collections for the Surrey Art Gallery, and he'll introduce our honored guests.
Thank you, Ingrid. Welcome, everybody. He is known the world over for his extraordinary carving and more recently his large three-dimensional castings in bronze and brushed aluminum. His paintings of the past 3 decades have opened up enormously rich terrain of possibility between coastal First Nations art and global painting traditions. And of course, his innovative jewelry making and challenging printmaking experiments have earned him extensive acclaim in the first half and middle periods of his career. And as the current exhibition here at the Surrey Art Gallery shows, printmaking remains a critical pillar within Robert Davidson's broad arsenal of art making. Davidson has been the recipient of many distinguished awards, including the Order of British Columbia, the Order of Canada, the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, and Lifetime Achievement Award for the British Columbia Achievement Foundation, and most recently, the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. And in just under 2 weeks, it has just been announced that he will be receiving one of this province's top visual art awards, the O'Dane Prize for Lifetime Achievement in the Visual Arts. I really am at a loss to think of what honor Robert hasn't won in this province. So it's really an honor to welcome here today Robert Davidson. And I wondered if maybe, Robert, if you could come up to the front now and join us. Thom is currently the Senior Curator Historical at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Ian has organized well over 100 exhibitions and authored dozens of important publications on art from British Columbia and art and artists from further afield. On a personal note, as a previous employee at the Vancouver Art Gallery in the late 90s and early part of this decade, I not only had a chance to and pleasure to see many of Ian's exhibitions that he had curated there, I was fortunate enough to be able to see them repeatedly. And I have to say they hold up after many repeated visits. I've seen some extraordinary shows that Ian has curated at the gallery. Among them, Andy Warhol, E.J. Hughes, Takeo Tanabe, Pablo Picasso, David Milne, and Rembrandt. But these are really only a small sampling of the extraordinary wealth of exhibitions and accompanying books that he has put on and produced at the Vancouver Art Gallery and across the country. Of particular note, Ian recently curated the exhibition Challenging Traditions, Contemporary First Nations Art of the Northwest Coast, a survey which included the likes of Robert Davidson, his brother Reg Davidson, Bo Dick, Susan Point, Joe and Lyle Wilson, Dempsey Bob, Sonny Asu, Don Yeomans, and Marianne Nicholson, among others. The exhibition was presented at the McMichael Contemporary Art Collection in Kleinburg, Ontario in 2009. And there, I think, are currently some rumors that it will be presented in this province in the coming months, so we might hear about that. Today, Ian's accomplishments as a curator were recognized last year, and in this, he joined the company of only a handful of curators in the history of this country when he was appointed the Order of Canada, the highest honor in this country. And so please join me in welcoming Ian Thom here today. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a couple words about the relationship between artists and curators. On the afternoon of the opening of Eagle Transforming, back in mid-April, which some of you may have been here for, I had a chance to approach Robert briefly about some thoughts related to today's particular event. It was late in the afternoon in the Surrey Art Gallery's program room, and many of the guests had filtered out at that point, but there was a small devoted group of chai drinkers remaining, and we were having some good conversation. And in the course of my discussion with Robert, I asked him if he would, in preparation for today's talk, he could maybe bring some juicy stories about Ian to the discussion. And he smiled and nodded and said he probably had several, and then he'd think about it and get back to me. To my surprise, no more than 20 minutes later, Robert walked briskly over to us as we were chatting across the room, and with a broad smile proceeded to share a delightful little tale about one of Ian's visits to Robert's studio on the edge of the Campbell River in Semiahmoo. I hope Robert will have a chance to repeat this story today, because it is a story that hints at the relationship that can sometimes develop between artist and curator, and how it can be a form of what I would call a companionship in translation. Most of the time, this artist-curator companionship is fleeting. The curator considers a set of work, attempts to situate this work in the gallery space in relation to other artists' work, or that specific artist's work, and then it's on to the next project, show, or book. But in certain circumstances, it is a form of companionship that can last for many years, and in some cases for decades. A companionship in translation, I would argue, involves a curator and critic through repeated studio visits, attending consecutive artist exhibitions, reading articles, going over books, seeking out patterns and relationships with the artist's work, and looking to reconcile these within the context that the work resides in. There is an intimacy with the work, and there's a constant reassessment of the artwork on behalf of the critic or curator. Evidence of this companionship in translation can be found in, for example, Emily Carr and the late curator Doris Shadbolt. We are fortunate enough today to have one such companionship, I think, by being in the company of both Robert Davidson and Ian Thom. Please join me in welcoming both of our distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, Jordan. What I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of introduction to this fine gentleman who's sitting beside me, by way of background, and then we will go through a few images, and then I thought Robert and I would ask Robert some questions, and hopefully he will give us one or two answers, and then there'll be an opportunity for other people to ask questions as well. Robert Davidson was born in 1946, which makes him 64 in 2010. But despite the fact that he's a youthful 64, his artistic career is actually stretches over 50 years. He began making art in 1959. He did so in his father's village of Old Masset on Haida Gouache, where he worked with both his father, Claude Davidson, and with his grandfather, Robert Davidson Sr. He initially began by making work that out of a particularly Haida material, I guess I would say, and that was argillite. He hasn't made argillite poles for a very long time now, and I suspect if you asked him, he'd probably say no, he wouldn't do it now. But he initially established some sort of entry into the art world by carving argillite and began to sell the work. He came to Vancouver in 1965 to finish his high school career. And while going to high school, he continued to carve argillite and did demonstrations and so on in the city. And it was at one of those demonstrations, the Hudson Bay, I think, where another individual came along and noticed that what he was doing, and that individual was a man by the name of Bill Reed. He recognized that this teenager, because he was a very young boy at that point, was producing some rather extraordinary things, and invited Robert to come along and spend some time with Bill. And that led to about an 18-month period of time when Robert worked with Bill. He began to do a lot of more two-dimensional work. He did engravings on copper plates and began to do work in silver. And he carved a pole with Bill, where in usual sort of First Nations teaching style, Bill carved one side and Robert carved the other side, and that way Robert could learn how Bill approached carving, and Robert began to develop his own identity as a carver. After spending a bit of time with Bill, Robert decided he wanted to do some further training, and he did something rather unusual for a First Nations person in the 1960s, and that was that he went to the art school, the Vancouver School of Art, where he didn't spend a lot of time, but the time he did spend there, I think, was notable for the fact that it put a great deal of emphasis on drawing. He'd done a little bit of drawing with Bill as well, but after the time he was at the art school, I think it's fair to say that drawing has been an essential part of his artistic armament ever since then. Robert has an extraordinary range of notebooks, of drawing notebooks that he's kept all the way through that time period, and he continues to go back and look at earlier source material. But he was also developing, even though he was a man only probably about 20 years old, he was also beginning to develop an independent career as an artist. And an opportunity came along in 1968 when the Gittin-Max School of Northwest Coast Art in Kassan needed someone to come and teach artists, young First Nations people of a variety of ancestries, how to make First Nations art. And I think they initially asked Bill, but Bill said no, he didn't want to go, and he suggested that he knew someone who might be a good person to go, and that was Robert Davidson. So at the age of 22, Robert Davidson was teaching other people how to make art. And that began what can only be described as an extraordinarily distinguished teaching career, which continues to this day in a variety of ways. But interestingly enough, of course, when he was in Kassan, he was not in Haida territory, and he was actually having to teach people how to make Tsimshian art, not Haida art. And so this gives you an idea of just how flexible and how inventive this individual is. But it's also during that time when he was in Kassan that he began to make prints. And that's really the focus of what this exhibition is. And this is the first, Eagle Transforming the Prints of Robert Davidson is the first exhibition devoted solely to Robert's prints since 1979. Which is, so it's been a long time in coming, and it tries to trace the sort of varieties of subject matters and the shifts that occur within his career. So what I'm going to do now is go over, is show you a few images from the exhibition, and I'm going to say some things about them, and if Robert wants to say something, he will certainly chime in as well as we go. The very first print Robert did was this a very small print, which is called a frog crest, which is based on a dance apron, which is actually in the Hazelton Museum. He had been introduced to screen printing by a rather roundabout process. He didn't, as far as I know, do any printmaking at the art school. No, he first became involved with screen printing when he was in high school, when he helped print T-shirts. And so he decided to make some small cards and announcements when he was there, and they were reasonably successful. These were in large editions. Generally, I think for this one, they would have been 600 or thereabouts.
Yeah, this was actually a card.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his signature is in fact printed on the actual image. But this was something that was not the first time for anyone First Nations ancestry had made prints. Ellen Neal had made some prints in the 1940s, and Doug Cranmer and a couple of others had made prints in the 60s. But from this point onwards, Robert makes prints. And I think one of the arguments I make in the exhibition, and I think is really is without sort of doubt that this is true, is probably more than any other First Nations artist, he has used the printmaking medium as a way to express himself and explore new ideas. Now, sometimes this led him to do things that could only be described as rather extraordinary bits of iconography for a Haida person. This is the announcement, the birth announcement of his daughter Sarah in 1973. Now, I can assure you there is nothing even remotely equivalent to this image in Haida art prior to 1973. Because what you see here, obviously, is his wife Susan in giving birth to their daughter, and in a way, Sarah's kind of like helping herself out of the womb below, and obviously there's an emphasis on Susan's lungs here. Susan, of course, his first wife, was not actually a Haida person, and she had to be adopted into the Haida nation, became a raven, because as probably most of you will know, lineage, and as to whether or not you were a raven or an eagle, Robert is an eagle, is passed down matrilineally rather than patrilineally. And so Sarah is a raven, as her mother was indeed a raven. But this, as I say, is an image that is completely without precedent in Haida art, and it was an example of just how courageous he was as a visual thinker, that he was willing to do something as unusual as this. At this point in his career, all of the prints are being made based on drawings that he's made, and he's using relatively limited range of colors, in this case obviously black and red. And his very first prints, like the frog you just saw, of course, used single ink colors, and eventually they become more complex.
I'll just make a comment on that. I was there for the birth announcement when Sarah was, on Sarah's birth. It was quite an experience for me to witness her birth. I remember being really excited, and I was so excited about when the doctor said, "Oh, the baby's coming now, the baby's coming." I said, "What is it? What is it?" And the doctor said, "I don't know, the hair's black anyway." So all I could see was the crown of her head, and I was still wanting to know whether it was boy or girl. But thank you, Ian. What's hanging down from the chin of the lady is actually a beak, which symbolizes Susan being adopted into their raven clan, and the two feathers coming off the head are feathers for their raven. And it sounds like all your questions are really paying off there, Ian. One of the stories that I want to talk about with Ian, when we first started working together, he came out to my studio several times, and having demonstrated carving in public for quite a few years, I got to be really annoyed with questions. You know, what kind of wood is it? What's that image you're doing? What's the story? You know, all these little silly questions. Anyway, Ian came with a concentrated barrage of questions, and when I got annoyed with his questions, I would answer him in Haida. And then he said, "How do you spell that?"
You know, nothing if not persevering. Anyway, the other, of course, thing that's remarkable about this image of Sarah's birth is you actually, have a clear expression of the process of the birth, and obviously here Susan is grasping her legs, to sort of to suggest this whole pushing out of the baby. Again, something quite extraordinary. I'm just curious, Robert, when you did this, did any other Haida people say anything to you about this image?
Not really. Like the art in Masset, where I come from, there wasn't really any exposure to like classic Haida art. I remember when I came to Vancouver, there was not one bit of evidence of Haida art in the village. There weren't any tonopoles. When I came to Vancouver and saw the tonopoles that were collected from Haida Gouache, I was really blown away, and then I'd go home and see nothing. And so, and in fact, I felt kind of like a missionary. I went knocking on every door in the village and asked if they had any pieces of art, and there wasn't one. I found one piece of one storage box. So people at home weren't really exposed to the art. So when they saw that, I think they saw it more like it was illustrative.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I forgot to say in my little introductory remarks is in 1969, Robert erected the first pole in the village of Masset in over 40 years.
Actually about 90.
90 years.
Yeah.
And at that particular point, no one really who was alive remembered a pole having been erected before. And I mean, you bear in mind, 1969, Robert is a very young man. And so to be able to take on a task like this, and to sort of have the pole erected, and which is still standing in Masset, is an extraordinary thing to do. There are many other poles subsequent to that, but Robert's was the first. So he's always doing things to both challenge himself and also challenge the idea that what you can do within the confines of what is Haida art. Now, one of the things that takes a big leap time-wise to come, and you'll have to pronounce this because I never can pronounce the first part of this.
Cilialis.
Cilialis,
ravenfin.
Ravenfin killer whale. One of the things that Robert did with his printmaking is by the early 1980s, he produced a fairly considerable number of prints. Most of them were relatively modest in scale. In the 1980s, he began to change his method of making prints. Instead of just relying on pencil drawings, he began to produce large-scale gouache images, which he then used as the source material for his prints. And in this case, this is one of them. Now, initially, when he produced these prints, they were basically unmarketable, because people didn't know how to relate to them in terms of their scale or anything like this. But a mark of, I think, just how courageous he is as an innovator, he just kept producing things on that sort of scale, and eventually probably realizing that people would eventually catch up to him, and eventually they did. I guess one of the questions I would have for you is, was there any particular thing that caused you to change to using gouache as opposed to using the pencil?
Yeah, in 1981, I hosted a potlatch in Masset, and one of the laments I kept hearing at home is they can't sing the song because they don't have any drum. And so, a potlatch, for those who don't know, is a public forum where the host it's a public forum, a political forum where we make statements and also reaffirm our cultural values. And so the payment, like the potlatch, you give payment to the witnesses. Like in this case, all of you would be witnesses to what is happening here, and so you, at the end of the evening, you would be paid for your services. And so the drum, like I made 24 drums and painted about a dozen of them, and gave them out to the singers. And so there was no more excuse. And I was really amazed on how fast and spontaneous painting was on the drums. And so that led me from the drum to the paper painting.
Now, also, of course, at this time, you'd also started the Rainbow Creek Dancers in 1980.
Yeah.
And you'd begun which meant that it was the first troupe of people trying to sing and dance traditional Haida dances and songs. And one of the initial problems you had was finding people who owned those songs and getting permission to use those songs.
Yeah, a lot of that knowledge was gone, and I learned a lot of all the songs by tape. And when I thought I memorized the song or learned the song, I would go to my grandmother and sing it in front of her, and I'd be sweating like crazy and not speaking the language. She was able to help me to correctly pronounce the words.
Mm-hmm. Now, later on, Robert begins to use what can only be described as colors that you don't normally expect to see in traditional Haida art. And you can see that in this work called Echoes from the Supernatural. Now, one of the other things that's significant about this particular image is, of course, it's based on a drum. Hence the circular form. And one of the great challenges, obviously, he has in dealing with a rectangular piece of paper is how do you fill the other elements of the image. And here he's done things that are really remarkably subtle pieces of printing in terms of the yellow on yellow images that occur on the outside edges. So he's been able to. He's always generally had a source image which he's decided it would work well as a print, but occasionally you've found that you've made some slight changes in terms of the color when it actually comes to the print itself.
Well, this comes from having printed doing the prints early in my career, where when I've overlaid one color onto another, I noticed that it created a shadow. And so that's when I started to expand on that idea, like the ghosting on the outside here is actually, like if you look at it really carefully, this face here is echoing right here. And there's another face here with the fingers here and the feet of that person there. And the face here with the hands, and they're connected to the feet here. But don't ask me what they're doing.
In a work such as this one, how much is the story important to you versus the formal aspects of it?
I'm more exploring space and also exploring color. Like if you look at, this is actually, I've done 2 variations of this same design, and this one is the second variation where I've become more elaborate. And I'm also playing with positive and negative, where negative becomes positive and positive becomes negative. Here we have, this is a wolf, the mouth here, the tongue, the nostril, the eye, the eyebrow, which separates the head from the ear. And this is the tail of the wolf. And the hind foot of the wolf is also the beak of this eagle. And the forefoot, like the cross-hatching here, would be like the arm connecting to the foot, or the leg connecting to the foot. But it's also the what Bill Thom calls the tertiary area. And so I'm more experimenting with, and also challenging the viewer, like to give the viewer something interesting to look at. Like one of the, like I have apprentices right now, and I'm continually working with them that for them to challenge the viewer to look at the piece more than 10 seconds or 5 seconds.
Well, I think that one of the things that's absolutely true of your work as developed is that if you only give it, if you only give the work 10 seconds, then you've shortchanged yourself because there's much more there. This is a rather extraordinary, another really extraordinary image in terms of Robert's career. The world is sharp as the edge of a knife. And I think it's probably best if he says in his own words what the significance of the title is.
Well, it's actually an ancient Haida proverb. And one, like, I was really lucky that I had such a beautiful grandmother and beautiful grandfather, and I also had 7 aunties. My dad had 7 sisters and a whole pile of cousins. And anyway, one of the really special moments I had with Nani, I'll call her Nani, my grandmother, was about 5 o'clock in the morning. She was an early bird, and she also told me a lot of the secrets, a lot of the cultural knowledge that I use today, and that I'm also handing on to the next generation. Like the proverb is, the world is as sharp as the edge of a knife. And I asked her one day what that meant, and she said that when we're walking, that there's a knife's edge wherever we're walking, and if we're not careful, we could fall off and die. And what I got from that was that she said there was one time someone who was really excited and jumping up and down, he fell off the edge. And it's almost like when I'm excited and overconfident, then my world collapses. Like I feel when I get overconfident, then the nothing, like all what I think is going to work for me collapses. And I like to expand that idea, the world is as sharp as the edge of the knife. I always thought of it as a straight line, but one day I thought of it as a circle. And I use I expand on this idea with that thin yellow line, circle. You could see it in the center. And that would be the present moment. We live on that very sharp edge. And on the inside is what I call culture or knowledge. And what's outside the circle is yet to be experienced. And in order for us to expand that circle, we have to understand, we really have to learn our history and where we came from. So it's very much like the art. If we jump in the arena and think that we're going to create great art without any knowledge, then it's usually a hit and miss.
It looks initially as though it's a very simple formal design, but as you can see, it has a much more complex meaning to it. But I mean, one of the remarkable things about his work is that even if you know nothing about all of these, the larger story behind it, it still works extraordinarily well as a composition. And I think that, this is based on, at this point, on a large-scale gouache drawing.
That That idea came to me when I was having lunch one day, and like sometimes I'm doodling and waiting for lunch or something, and that I remember drawing that idea on a napkin.
Well, great things come from very small beginnings. Why is this print called Getting Ready to Take Flight? Obviously, it's a bird, and presumably an eagle here?
Yeah, this is an eagle. I was approached by the Children Gallery in North Vancouver.
Artists for Kids.
Yeah, Artists
Yes.
for Kids. They have quite a collection of artists who are contributing to that gallery to encourage art to the next generation. And so I thought, well, I wanted something meaningful for as a gift to the gallery, and Getting Ready to Take Flight would be, I felt, was fitting for the children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really an eagle. The wing coming down here, oops, 2 feathers, the other wing. And what you'll see happening also in the art is the ovoid here would be the joint, the ball and socket of the wing, feather design. And here I chose to use what we call Kugenjut, mouse woman. And you will see that very image on most of the storage boxes that were created pre-1800 or in the 1800s. The Kugenjut usually has a dimple, mouth, eye, and an ear, and sometimes a beak. Like here, this would be a beak. And Kugenjut can, like a complete Kugenjut, has 5 parts, and he or she can exist on 2 parts.
That's one of the things that regularly happens within your work, as you have the creature gets represented by a tiny section or sections of the creature.
Yeah.
And that's something that is both traditional, but also is fairly contemporary in your practice. This work, Half a Soul, is obviously very different in terms of format. There's a human figure here, but can you explain the story behind this one?
Half a soul is actually half of the soul catcher that the shaman used during their ceremonies. If the soul catcher is actually hung around their neck in this direction rather than up and down, and the mouth, it usually has a mouth here, eyes, and the other half would be up here. And so I don't know, I get kind of disillusioned by where we're going as a people. So I kind of wonder if what we're doing is searching for the other half. I don't know what will happen when we find it.
Well, presumably you'll be whole. One of the other things, of course, that's interesting about this work, and it appears in a number of works within the exhibition, is that this is quite asymmetrical in the composition. And that's something that, again, Robert has done on a number of occasions within his work, where he has done, where if you look at very traditional pieces from the 19th century, they tend to be, on the whole, symmetrical. So this is a very contemporary practice that he's doing here. I'm curious, did you get any comments from fellow Haida artists about that?
Well, when I started doing like profiles instead of symmetry, that happened when I was starting to do jewelry. Like jewelry, like a bracelet, for example, would be about depending on the width, and about 6.5 inches long. And if you cut it in half, so you only have that small space to work with. And so when I realized that I can use that whole space, it freed me up on designing. And so that carried on to other works. And also it's very laborious to always match up. So you could say I was getting lazy.
We should all be lazy in the same way. I'm curious that you mentioned the issue about the bracelets. My impression has always been, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's generally been the prints have been developed from some other art form. Has it ever been the other way around, where print has influenced a piece of sculpture or a painting?
Right now, a lot of my ideas come from, like for the prints, they came more from bracelets, or what I'm doing now today is totally different from what I've done 10 years ago. But at the same time, I was looking at one of my sketchbooks in 1987, and I was really amazed to see some of the drawings that were appearing then are actually some of the paintings I'm doing today. So,
You're catching up to yourself.
yeah. But I think my feeling is every medium, like when I look back at the old pieces, the old masters, every medium created its own style. Like argillite started off like a wood style, the old wood style, and then as it developed to today, it's become more of its own style. Basketry is the same way, where the designs on baskets are totally different from like the graphics, the weaving, the button blankets. The designing on the button blankets was adapted to that new material. And so every medium creates its own style, and I feel the painting is going in the same direction for me.
Mm-hmm. This is another example of asymmetry, a very considerable asymmetry, and actually this is an example of Robert reacting to what was essentially a relatively recent event. This was a reaction to the disasters of September 11th, 2001. Robert felt that if a response that was equally violent would have created symmetry, and he preferred the idea that one should think about moving forward with asymmetry rather than symmetry. And this produced this rather exceptional print here. In terms of the images, it almost becomes completely abstract, but there are still creatures there.
Yeah, this is what I call chamos. Chamos is a sea monster, and sea monster is one of the greatest fears that the old people had when they were traveling by canoe. If they saw a sea monster in the water, and quite often, actually, the translation for the sea monster is actually a deadhead. And so if they saw that in the water, they would actually paddle for miles around it for fear of that deadhead capsizing the canoe. And so there was a lot of fear around chamos. And so I chose, actually I had this idea for about a year in my drawing book, and when that disaster happened in 2001 in New York City, I finished the idea and called it looking at asymmetry. The mouth here of the chamos, the two eyes, the nostril, and this could be a tail of the sea monster. And like if the American people chose not to retaliate, then it stays asymmetrical. The experience becomes asymmetrical, but if they choose to retaliate, then it becomes symmetrical.
Mm. And we know what happened after that.
it's still happening.
Sometimes Robert can't resist a bit of what I describe as humor. Obviously, one of the things, when you become a significant figure, a significant cultural figure, as Robert has become through his artwork, his political work, his work as a dancer, as a singer, he's become an important figure in the community. You obviously get criticized occasionally. And you get people complaining, oh, that Robert Davidson, he's doing this or he's doing that. And so Robert came up with this, and you can see it's put your complaints here, which happens to be a stylized ear.
Well, I must have a fetish about ears, because it's not the first time it showed up.
No.
One time I was driving to Vancouver, like when I was on one of my trips to sell my work to the different galleries in town. I was really high, I was feeling good, the music was playing loud, and every gallery I went to, they started complaining about this and complaining about that, and I go to the next gallery, the same thing, and by the time I was through making my rounds in town, I was coming home and I was feeling kind of worn out, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we can go to a place in some room and put our complaints there? And so that's when I came up with this idea.
It's a fairly vivid idea. This is a Helang or healing a Thunderbird image, but unfortunately, I realized after this presentation was made, you can't really see. One of the really fascinating things about this image is that on the bottom, on the actual print, when you see it in the gallery, there's a strip of green, which is a really challenging way of introducing yet another color into this. So I apologize for the fact that it got sort of trimmed too precisely. You used this in a variety of ways. I mean, you used this as a blanket as well, didn't you?
Yeah. One of the great things about the art is like the lines are really seductive. Like when I'm designing, like this line here is actually creating an energy field around this ovoid here. So this line here parallels the ovoid, and it's picked up by another shape. And this would be the nostril this would be the eye, nostril of the bird, and the beak comes down here. And Thunderbird doesn't really have teeth, but that's what I call artistic license. So we have this same space here. I call it a trineg because it has 3 points. Mm-hmm. The trineg is really stretched around to isolate the mouth, separate the mouth from the head. The foot, the leg, and foot. Like every line has a purpose. Like if you follow a line, it connects onto another line. Like that's one of the great joys I have when I'm drawing. Like I salivate when I'm designing. I get really excited about it.
But by this point, there's also a painting of this, an acrylic painting.
Yeah, most of the prints I'm doing today originate from paintings now, and I'm doing a lot of paintings, but not every painting becomes a print.
Right.
And I equate doing a print very much like doing publishing the idea, so there's a broader audience enjoying that image. Mm-hmm. I forgot what the question was. I don't think I answered the question.
Oh, I think you did.
Okay.
This is the last image I'm going to show today. This is called Occupied. And now I think it does a couple of the, from a formal point of view, he's very clearly had the image completely occupy the sheet of paper. How else is it occupied?
Well, when I did the initial idea, it looked like Octopus. And I had the hardest time saying octopi. So I decided to call it Occupied.
There you are, a special secret.
It could be a subliminal message also, because the Haida are working to resolve title. Mm-hmm. I feel we're doing it in a very good way, where we are including all the local people. It's not like this land is our land. This land is our land, so we need to find a very positive solution so we can all live together and make the best of our time on this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You will clearly see by looking at the images that we have just shown today, but also in the exhibition as a whole, that there's an extraordinary range of imagery, scale, use of color, and so on within Robert's career. So I'm curious, Robert, for you, what remains interesting to make in terms of making prints, and why is it as interesting now, or as it was in 1968?
What makes it interesting for me today is having mastered the knowledge of the art form. Like I like to think of the art form as two alphabets. You will see this these as ovoid shapes and the U shape. So those are the two alphabets, and they're continually interacting with each other. The U shape here, which is also the octopus head, the eye, and the octopus have a beak, but in this case they're symbolized as or illustrated here as with teeth, and so I'm more playing with the interaction, opposed to this is an eagle, this is a raven. The real fun I'm having is how to interact with the art, and I don't think that's a new thing. I really feel that, like when I look at the art form that was collected in the latter part of the 1700s at Contact, and the evolution from that piece right to about 1800, there was a definite development, and then we had this 50-year drought, when we lost 95% of the population. We lost our connection to cultural knowledge. We lost our connection to the song and dance, and now my generation, I feel it's our responsibility to pick up those pieces, and also to mentor the next generation. Like I feel we've complained long enough about the injustices of our past, and I really feel that the art is one way of reconnecting. It certainly was the catalyst that woke up people in Masset, where my grandparents' generation, they were shining for one day when the Thom was raised, and the fact that they were shining, it shone on us. It shone on my generation, and I'm so grateful that we had that moment, and now it's up to us to foster that moment and grow from that. And the art has certainly been a catalyst for us to reconnect with ancient knowledge.
One of the things that's striking about your career as a printmaker is that with only one or two exceptions, you've always made screen prints. Why is that? Well, you've made a couple of lithographs. Why is screen printing more appealing to you than, let's say, any other form of printmaking?
It's very, like, to do the art is very labor intensive. And then to do a print, like you only do one stroke, and wow, that image is perfect, and I find that very seductive. And so, like, when the printing's going really well, I want to do 500 of them. But when there's a real struggle to make that print, sometimes I'll stop at 25. And so, like, then you have 25 perfect images, and I find that very very fulfilling.
Do you ever? I mean, there's one print in this exhibition which I don't have an image of, but I mean that is basically completely abstract. Is that a direction you could see your work going into, or do you feel you're always going to relate back to creatures and the natural world?
Well, like, I've been giving design workshops to the next generation, and I was not brought up with the stories. A lot of the stories were gone, but fortunately we've had people like John Swanton in the early 1900s who spent a year up on Haida Gouache and documented many of the stories. And so I'm reading some of those stories and trying to make sense of some of those stories and using some of those stories for today. And like one painting, well, there's always a challenge. Like, sometimes I'm quite happy just to do the painting, and people like you will say, "Hey, what's the title?" So it's always that, like, a good push. Okay, what title can I give this? And so I have a painting. I just finished a painting. It's an eye looking down, and it's orange and red, and I want to show it. So to show it, people want a title. So on the spur of the moment, I titled it Wintertime. And the Haida word for wintertime is Kwao Gyang. And that's when you stand up to take care of nature because the snow is so high.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I'm playing with that, and I'm also using that mythology to help the next generation coming up, because I feel the more depth we have in relearning cultural knowledge, the stronger the foundation we can rebuild.
Well, and as you have said on many occasions, I mean, you need to know the rules of the art before you can break the rules. And clearly one of the things that's true about your career is you definitely know the rules. And so when you decide to break those rules, you in fact expand that culture, that circle of knowledge, and make it possible for other people to do other things. I'm aware of the fact that we're basically at our 3 o'clock time, and so I'd like to just ask you, Robert, if there's anything else that you'd like to say before we open it up to questions from the audience.
No, I thought you were pretty thorough there. Yeah.
Is there anything? Does anyone here have anything they'd like to ask Robert?
I was going to begin with a question, and then we'll open up to the floor. So thank you so much. I mean, that was incredible. That was very thorough. I think it answered, certainly for me, many of the questions that I had prepared. One of them that I do have, though, is it goes back to this relationship between the acrylic painting, Robert, and the screen prints. Because you were talking a little bit about for a moment about mediums and how mediums develop their own style. And Ian, you were talking about the relationship between the gouaches and the screen prints. It seems that when the paintings that I've seen, and I saw some of the recent ones in the studio, there seems to be a dialogue somehow going back and forth. There's a quality to some of the recent paintings that seem to pick up on some of the prints that we see in this show and in this exhibition, and vice versa. There seems to be a kind of translation or transition going on there. Just wondering if you could maybe say a few words about that relationship between the screen prints and the new acrylics.
Well, the very early prints that I did up to about 1980 were all pencil drawings, like Ian mentioned, and that took forever. And so I was painstakingly drawing one line at a time, like for every, like I would draw this line here, and that would take me maybe about 20 minutes. And now I can paint that in about 3 or 4 minutes. And so what the painting did was expedite the idea, it made it more spontaneous. In fact, my daughter, Sarah, I learned a lot from Sarah and Ben as they were growing up. One time I had Sarah, she was drawing, she was, I think, 3 or 4 years old. They were always doing drawings, and Sarah was drawing one painting per minute. And she said, "Robert, how come you're not painting for fun?" They're still calculating this one line, and she's still... So the painting, actually, I felt my development accelerated after I started to paint. Because I was, if one line didn't work, I'd erase 1 hour's worth of work. And then I have to redraw that whole line. Whereas with paint, it's a lot more forgiving. And for gouache is less forgiving than acrylic, because if when I make a mistake in acrylic, I can actually white it out and redo it. Whereas with gouache, sometimes I'm scraping it off the paper.
There is one question I did forget to ask you, and that's how do you decide which image is going to be a print versus just remain as a painting?
Well, it's usually on one that I'm very excited about. And sometimes I will say to myself, this is going to be a winner. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
Another question before we open up to the floor is this relationship between ceremonial...
The personal art, the crest, and personal items, and trade items, the trade and commercial. And today we're still working on those 3 levels. Now that I've said it, there will be other levels to the art that will people will want to define. There's a blending of Western art with native art, which I haven't quite accepted, because I feel there's so much to explore within Northwest Coast art. I feel I'm only touching the surface of the potential of Northwest Coast art.
So I'm sure we have a number of questions. Let's see, we'll start.
You made a few comments in the course of your remarks. I was wondering if you could elaborate the effect that you're dissatisfied where we are going as a people. I wasn't clear whether you were saying we, IDA, or we, humanity. And then you made reference to, you were expanding asymmetry, and then you talked about the development and involvement in reconstructing the future. And I was wondering if you could address those either individually or together?
Ooh, can I do it one at a time? We as a people, like as humankind, like I feel, I guess more in the Western world where corporations are rule opposed to governments or the people. I'm quite afraid of what's happening, the acceleration of how we're extracting all the natural resources without thinking of our children and grandchildren. Like I feel, what's going to be left for them? You know, and there's always an argument about why we should build the new dam up in the Peace River or the wind farm up on Haida Gouache. Like what? There's no evidence that it's safe. And it's all hearsay, you know, like look what happened with the fish farms. We were at a potlatch in Alert Bay 2 years ago, and they said they haven't had salmon for their feasts and potlatches for years because of the salmon farms. So that kind of, you know, there's all kinds of arguments about, you know, why we should do this and why, and that, when I see evidence of why, of the direction we're going in, I really feel we need to be a little more cautious. And for the Haida people, I'm excited that being a grandfather now made me realize I have a bigger responsibility in mentoring the next generation. I was pretty casual with my kids, but now I have grandkids. I said, okay, I want a good place for them. And it's not so much just the grandchildren, it's all grandchildren. Like I feel, I have apprentices in my studio and I'm talking exactly the same way I'm talking here to them so that they can, so we can build a larger team that can help create this quiet revolution that I'm on.
I'm just wondering who is apprenticing with you now, just examples, and how do you know, how does the choice come about? I'm just curious what the process was.
I'll tell you a secret as long as you don't tell anybody. Whoever is brave enough to ask. I have 3 people right now in the studio. One is a Tsimshian from Metlakatla, Alaska. I've had 9 people complete their apprenticeship with me, and I'm also giving workshops at home. It's a volunteer basis. Like I feel like I have titles to the workshops. One, for example, is "Being Successful is No Accident," and that's one of the titles. Like I feel that the more information we give the new generation, the stronger they will be. Like I feel, I came from a very strong family background with my grandparents and all my cousins, and we've lost a lot of that over the last 30, 40 years because of the change that's happening, and I feel we need to reconnect with some of those values that solidify families.
I'll add one little comment about who Robert takes as an apprentice. They have to prove that they're serious. They will not survive in that studio if they're not serious. And several artists who have worked with him have told me that he worked them all day and then they were just dead tired and went home at night, and that was when they got to do their own work. Because when they're in Robert's studio, they're doing Robert's work. But if they're not serious, he doesn't have time for them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ian. I forgot to mention that part.
As you can see, if anyone else has any questions? Yes?
I have a curious question because I know Robert art did formal drawing training where he had to draw nudes and things like that. And I'm wondering now when you have apprentice, if you require that they also draw, and how are you able to teach drawing that deals with the supernatural world, or this other part, rather than the traditional Western view of drawing? How do you approach that?
Thank you for reminding me about the nude part. Maybe I'll make that part of my curriculum. Well, drawing is more of a technique. So I ask them to draw from these images. And so when I went to the art school, I was really amazed on drawing the nudes, like the human figure, and then it became part of my vocabulary. And as I learned to draw, then I was able to draw the ovoid a lot easier. And now that I really instill that they do at least 1 or 2 hours a day of drawing. And I know that it's very important, and also visualize, like memorize those shapes, because make those shapes part of your memory. Put them in and let it be part of your memory bank, and you can draw upon it when you're doing your own creations. Like I feel, I really like this story where there were 3 different people practicing basketball, and one was shooting the basket, physically shooting the basketball, and the other was visualizing shooting the basket, and the other one didn't do anything. And the first 2 they improved, and the other one that didn't do anything didn't improve at all. And I feel when I'm going to a museum, or when I'm looking at an old piece, I'm feeling that image, and when I feel that image, then I can draw upon that experience when I'm creating. And drawing helps you to make that connection a lot quicker. Okay,
Yes?
one more.
This is a silly question you could answer me back in China. Is native art because you're native or because of the style is native?
Good question. Actually, I use that when I'm doing critique on native art. I said, just because you have brown eyes and black hair doesn't mean it's native art. Like I feel native art, Northwest Coast art is different from all the other art forms. Northwest Coast art is the body of people from Alaska to just a little south of Seattle. And these linguistic groups use the 2 same shapes that you were looking at today, and that's the ovoid shape and the U shape. And that is what we call Northwest Coast art. And each linguistic group developed their own style. Like a trained eye can say this is Kwakwakwiwak, or this is Tsimshian, or this is Haida, or this is Salish, or this is Nuu-chah-nulth.
Can non-native become a successful native artist?
That's happening right now. There's a group of people in Seattle that what we call, it's not derogatory, it's more of an identity. We call them the Seattle tribe. They're non-natives doing native art. And they're very successful, and they They're very, I really enjoy their company. At first I was very insecure, and I thought, oh, they shouldn't be doing our art. But I've come to terms with it, so I feel there's a camaraderie. In fact, I did an article or a speech, and I titled it, "A Thin Curtain Hangs Between Us." That's an expression in Haida where we're closely related, but there's a thin curtain hanging between us. In our relation, I'm talking about the Seattle people, our relation is the ovoid and the U-shape.
In 2008, I think it was, Robert was described as being a civic cultural treasure for the city of Surrey. In fact, he is a national and international cultural treasure. Thank you, Robert.